Hi, I'm Marilyn. Welcome to my studio. This video was created for my Thursday watercolor students at the West Pasco Art Guild in Port Richey. We tackled a pouring project, pouring watercolor, which is not at all like pouring acrylic paint. And my students asked if I could capture the steps of the process so they'd have something to refer back to if they wanted to try this process again. We worked from a common reference image so that we were tackling the same steps at the same time to learn specific techniques. And then each artist worked from their own original photo, one that they had taken, to create a piece all on their own. So I hope that you find this video helpful. If so, give it the thumbs up, and I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel. And let's take a look at how we went about the process of pouring watercolor. This is my version of the final painting. It was done on 1/6 of a full sheet of Arches 140-pound cold press paper. That's 10 inches by 11 inches, and that results in an 8 by 10 painting that will fit in a standard matte and 11 by 14 inch frame. I chose this photo for our shared reference image because of the distinct white area on his head, the edges of the feathers, the triangle of white on his back, and the few white spots on the piling. I cropped the photo to portrait orientation for a better composition, and then I converted it to black and white in order to better see the values. We're not concerned about local color in this project, but it is very important to be able to distinguish the full range of values. I traced the gull with a fine line permanent marker, and I paid special attention to the small shapes where I want to save the white of the paper. I rub graphite on the back of the traced bird, and then I lay it on my watercolor paper to transfer the lines. I find that using a ballpoint pen helps to ensure a more precise line. When I'm finished tracing, I go back to my reference image to reestablish or adjust lines. Once I start masking, it'll be too late. And because I like to paint to a standard size mat and frame, I use an old mat to double check that my image fits within the space the way I want it to. I notice that the edge of the piling are really close to the mat, so I erase them and I make the piling a little bit narrower so that I've got a little more space between the edge of the piling and the edge of the mat. Now it's time to get the paint ready. I'm working with one of each of the primaries, a red, a blue, and a yellow, and I'm using Old Spice containers, but any small jar with a tight-fitting lid will work. I put in a generous squeeze of paint, I'm going to say 1 inch or so, and then I add water. In these little jars, it was about a 1/2 inch, but ultimately what you want is the consistency of milk. Mixing the paint and water takes longer than you think. I started with a small spoon and I switched to an old brush. The video is speeded up, but you can see that you really have to work to emulsify the paint in the water. And then I repeated this process for the other 2 primaries. Now it's time to apply the masking fluid to the shapes where I want to keep the white of the paper. That's the top of his head, the tiny catchlight in his eye, and the edges of a few select feathers, and also some of those vertical shapes in the piling. I've tried all sorts of things to apply masking fluid, and my least favorite is a brush. And I've settled on embossing tools and a small palette knife. I'm able to create very fine lines, and it's easy to clean them off. For this project, I'm using Richeson masking fluid, but there are other brands that work just as well. I like to pour a small amount of fluid into an old contact lens case. It's spill resistant, and it can be closed up tight when I'm finished. I never work directly from the bottle, as air is the enemy of masking fluid. And a word of caution, do not shake the bottle. You'll create air bubbles that are difficult to get rid of, and you'll run the risk of that latex forming a ball in the bottle. If you feel you need to mix, gently roll that bottle back and forth a few times, and possibly even store it upside down. Your goal is to create interesting shapes as you paint with the masking fluid. Take your time, enjoy the process. When I'm finished, I set the board aside to dry thoroughly. I don't recommend using a hairdryer. The masking fluid must be totally dry before I begin to pour paint. While that masking fluid's drying, let me show you how I set up my space. My paper is stapled and taped to an incredible artboard by Graphics. You can use anything that will hold staples and tape, but because we're using so much water, we really want to anchor that paper down. I'm resting that board on an old cookie sheet. Anything that can catch the paint will work. An aluminum pan, palette lid, whatever. I have plenty of tissues and paper towels handy, along with a spray bottle of clean water and a container of clean water. I'll be using pipettes to pour the paint, but you can pour directly from the jar if you're brave. Now for the fun part. I wet my paper using a big soft brush with clean water, and I let the water settle into the paper. I don't want any puddles, just a nice glossy sheen all over. I use a tissue to pick up any extra. I have found that starting with yellow is my best bet. I get my best results. It's the lightest value, and I want to give it a fighting chance against the stronger red and blue that I'm going to add. I use a pipette or an eyedropper to gently pour paint onto the wet surface. A spray bottle with a fine mist works great to get the paint moving. Next, I add red, and I gently tilt the board to get the paint to move. I like those diagonal lines, that diagonal movement of the paint, and I'm always kind of aware of what direction the paint's moving. I keep that tissue handy because I like to mop up the extra that kind of builds up along the tape. And that keeps any backwash or blooms from forming along the edge. My goal in this step is to end up with a light value. This is going to be my background, and it will also form the light values within the bird's body and on the piling. I waited to add blue after the yellow had dried, as I was a little concerned that I'd get green right off the bat. But I just re-wet the paper gently again with that soft brush and repeated the pouring process. Now that the three colors are thoroughly dry, it's time to decide how much of this first poured value I want to save, and it turns out that it's really a lot. Instead of using masking fluid to protect the sky behind the bird and the piling, I decided to use contact paper. I roughly traced the outline of the bird and cut it out. The leftover or negative shape is ready to use as a mask, and I just positioned it over my painting. Now I fill in the gap between the edge of the contact paper and my pencil line with masking fluid. I'll take care of the space between his legs later. But oops, you can see I dribbled a drop of masking fluid on his body. I have to wait until that drop is totally dry before I try to pick it up. But now that my mistake is dry, I pick it up with a rubber cement pickup tool and we're good to go. Now that all the light value is masked with a combination of masking fluid and contact paper, I can pour the next layer, which will create middle values. I wet the paper again with clean water using a spray bottle and very light brush strokes. I don't want to disturb that first layer of paint. And again, I start with yellow, followed by red and blue. I gently tilt the board and mop up any excess with a tissue. I don't have to rush. As long as the paper is wet, I can continue to add paint. I'm not trying to precisely control where the color goes. I'm more interested in these three primary colors mingling to create interesting secondary and tertiary colors. The goal for this layer is a mid-value. Now that the paper is thoroughly dry, I have to decide how much of this mid-value I want to save. I'm thinking I want some feather shapes and more variation in the piling. The shapes I cover with masking fluid are getting smaller. And now that the masking fluid is thoroughly dry, I wet the paper, again gently, and add more color. I'm starting with blue as I'm going for darker values with this pour. When I'm satisfied with the color and the value, I let it dry thoroughly. Don't be afraid to use your finger to get the paint to move around some of those masking fluid shapes that are kind of damming up the liquid and keeping it from moving. Now, the big reveal. It's time to take off the contact paper and dried masking fluid. You never know exactly what you're going to find. I use a rubber cement pickup tool to remove the masking fluid, and I run my fingers lightly over the surface to check for masking fluid that's difficult to see. It's all got to come off. The final step is to use a brush to add your darkest values, like on his legs, the underside of his beak, his eyeball, and then to also go in and soften any edges of white that seem too harsh. This is the fine-tuning stage, and it's where you really can make your poured painting pop. And here's our finished product. And a recap of the steps that we followed to get there. So there you have it, a watercolor pour of a gull on a piling. If you're interested, the supplies I used are listed in the comments. I'd like to give a special thanks to Wisconsin artist Joy Moon, friend, mentor, teacher, and the person who got me started on this wild ride of pouring watercolor. Any mistakes are all mine, and successes are a credit to the great teaching that Joy provided as I was learning to pour watercolor. Again, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and better yet, subscribe to my channel, Marilyn Westcott Art, for more adventures in watercolor painting. I hope to see you again real soon. Happy painting!